Today is July 23rd, 2006. I am Jessica Clark. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Allen, Saskatchewan in Canada. Can you please state your full name to begin with?
Wilfred Jacob Boechler.
And where were you born?
I was born here in Allen
Okay, and when were you born?
on February the 14th, 1926.
So you're a Valentine's Day baby.
Yeah, but doesn't mean too much now. I did when I was young.
What did it mean when you were young?
Oh, well, it was quite a fuss, mate, because you were a Valentine baby. But
Do you know any stories about your birth?
I do remember, well, from what I was told, not that I remember, but, in those days you were baptized as soon as possible after you were born. And our farm was out where the potash mine is. And therefore they took me in and being in the wintertime, of course, they took me in with a sleigh, and my mother was very concerned that they wouldn't tip and I might get killed before I get baptized. After I got baptized, it wouldn't matter that much, but as long as it wasn't before I was baptized.
Well, you survived.
Yeah, I survived, yeah.
Can you share with us some of your earliest childhood memories?
Well, I suppose most of us can't go back too far because we didn't reach the age of reason until we got fairly old, I guess. But I suppose, living in a big family with many siblings older than you are, I was the third youngest. There's an awful lot of care given to us by our siblings. Our mother, wouldn't have too much to do with the young children as far as raising them go, because the sisters were there. I had 6 sisters, and all older than me. And as far as the recreation part goes, there wasn't that much, except the things that we made ourselves. Being a large family, we could play ball together and those kind of things. It was a poor time, because by the time I got to be 4 years old, I got into the 30s, and those were very difficult years. One year when things were really difficult, my father, after butchering a young heifer, used to tan the hide and made me some moccasins out of it. He was pretty proud of them, but I wasn't. They were hard to walk with and so on, but we did the best we could.
You mentioned growing up during what has now become termed as the Dirty Thirties.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what the Dirty Thirties were like?
Well, first of all, being that we were farmers, we had our own livestock. We had our own eggs, we had our own milk and our cream and homemade cottage cheese and those things. We had a garden, and a big garden, and lots of help to work in the garden, especially, because I was one of the younger ones. So as far as being hungry, no, we never went hungry, but there wasn't too much of a variety. Especially I remember, like in 1937, it was one of the worst years. We didn't even take the thrashing machine out that year because there was nothing to thrash. Feed for the cattle, there was very little, and much of our livestock died during that winter. It was the winter when in the fall I remember that my father went to town and he bought, I think it was in the neighborhood of 10 100-pound bags of Robin Hood flour with the money that he had. And that, with what we had, was supposed to carry us through the winter. He did have enough to once in a while buy a 25-pound pail of peanut butter. So peanut butter and bread was an awful lot of our staples for that winter. But it didn't hurt us. We survived quite well.
What was the weather like back then?
It was very cold, much different than it is now. And of course, there's always that danger of when you measure a snowbank when you're 10 years old and you measure one when you are 18 or 20 years old, that snowbank looked pretty tall because it was taller than you are. But when you're 18, you look down on the snowbank. But there was a tremendous amount of snow and very dry summers. So in the spring, when we planted, things started to grow quite well, but there was never the moisture to carry it through, and 37 being one of the worst ones. Also, though, in 1935, we had a beautiful crop. The wheat was probably 3 feet tall and nice and thick, but it burned out in early August to when we thrashed it, It was just about all straw, very little grain in it.
Can you tell me a little, did you ever witness like a dust storm or a
Oh
sand
yes,
storm?
oh yes. Dust storms, I'll tell the world, we had lots of dust storms. I remember one day my older brother and I took a hay rack and we went out to a straw stack and loaded up some straw and drove out where the wind was blowing the sand across the growing grain and threw some straw in, trying to stop the sand from drifting. It was all useless, but we tried the best we could, yeah. Yeah, there were ridges, especially, you know, along the fence lines, there would always be weeds growing. And some of these weeds, because snow would accumulate there in the wintertime, because of the weeds, and there was more moisture there. So the weeds would grow in there, and then the dust storms would come along, and they would bank that dust in there. After a year or two, you'd have 3 feet of sand blowing in, and the topsoil was blowing off of the land. Even into the 40s, we had crops with the fields with the dust in the spring. The dust blew off so much that you could see all the wheat laying there. And we'd go out with a harrow and try and harrow it and try and work some of it into the ground so it would grow again.
How did that, the dust storms and the thick sand and all of that affect the farm, like the farming machinery in keeping it in working condition? Did it have any effect with that, or?
It did, but you see, everything was drawn by horses, so there wasn't any speed involved in the turning of things. So it didn't wear out like it would wear out if you were going at 6 miles an hour down a field. The horses traveled at about 2.5 miles an hour, and so therefore everything turned slow, and you would grease it and so on. So that wasn't too big a problem as far as the machinery wearing out. But it was a problem, you know, even in the homes. The homes weren't as dust-proof as they are now. Sometimes you would have to set the dishes upside down on the table before the meal so that they wouldn't be full of, or half, you know, but some dust in them, you know, by the time you came to eat. And this carried on even into the 40s. Into the late 40s, we still had a lot of dust storms. The method of cultivating changed. And instead of making the summer fallow the way they did back in the 30s, we used cultivators and left the trash, which is the straw, on top of the soil, and then it wouldn't blow that way because the summer fallow wasn't jet black, it was covered with straw because of the different ways of tilling the soil.
What about keeping the animals hydrated? Was that a lot harder with all of the dust and the heat?
Well, it would have been to some people, I suppose. But like for ourselves, we had a good well and a windmill, and there was always wind. And so there was always a lot of water, you know, so that you could water the stock. And you know, things were so much different because you would get up in the morning early and you would harness your horses and feed them, and then you'd go out around, have breakfast around 7 o'clock. You'd be out there working till noon, come back home, feed the horses, water them, go back and work till 6 o'clock. And then you'd come back home again, and that was it for the day as far as working on the land goes.
Let's see here. Let's turn a little bit from the dirty 30s and talk more about weather in general, maybe not just during that time period. Did you ever witness a tornado or a severe thunderstorm when you were growing up?
Thunderstorms, yes. Tornadoes, no. We never had any tornadoes in this area up here. We had some strong winds, and you'd hear sometimes of certain places like in Regina, which is 150 miles south of here. It blew down a grandstand because a strong wind had gone through there. And I witnessed winds of 50 miles an hour, and it's quite hard to walk against the wind at 50 miles an hour. But that was basically the highest speed that I ever encountered, was a 50-mile-an-hour wind. But we had the winds, like I say, maybe 60 and 70 miles an hour. Now, whether you call them a tornado or not, I don't know.
What about blizzards? Did you ever see any blizzards?
Yes, we had lots of blizzards. Not just in the 30s. We had a blizzard back in the early 50s after I was married, where I could not take the livestock out of the barn for 3 days. In order to go from the barn from the house to the barn or vice versa, which was about 150 feet. You'd have to wait until it eased up enough so that you could see the barn, and then you'd run across. And when you want to go back again, you'd wait until it eased up enough so you could see the house and then run across. Many people talk about putting a rope from the house to the barn and following it. And I guess if it was much further than that, you'd have to do that. But, and that was just one of them. We had lots of blizzards, you know, where there was no way you could go to town during that day or those 2 days that that blizzard was going. Fortunately, again, things have changed. We don't have them anymore like that.
How about ice storms? Was there any like freezing ice storms or anything like that back then?
Well, I don't know whether you want to go into the 50s or just in the 30s.
You can go into the 50s, that's fine.
In the 50s, early 50s, we had an ice storm that we were without power for about 3 days, and we were very concerned about the meat in the deep freeze and so on, because an ice storm had come through early spring in between Saskatoon and here. Saskatoon is about 40 miles northwest of here, and took down some big power lines that were bringing power into our area, and we were without power for 3 days.
Do you remember how old you were when you got power? Were you already married the first time?
Yes, I was married. I got married in 1950, and we got the power in 1955.
Okay. So your entire childhood out on the farm, you did not have any type of...
No running water, no power, no phone.
Did you have a radio?
We got a radio, I would say maybe in about 39.
What was that like for you?
Oh, I'll tell you, that was something else. We could not believe that we could sit there and listen to what was going on in Toronto in a hockey game, because that was our great thing, was the Toronto Maple Leaf hockey team. And those radios were run by a battery. And when the battery got real low, you could hardly hear anything. So my oldest brother would sit with his ear up to the radio, and he would be announcing back to us behind him as to what was going on.
Did you listen to anything else besides hockey on the radio?
Oh yes, we'd listen. On a cold winter night, you could get Nashville, Tennessee, which is something you can't do, I don't think, on today's radios. But on a cold winter night, you could get Nashville, Tennessee, and we used to listen to the Grand Ole Opry, Roy Acuff and the Grand Ole Opry down there, yeah.
Would this be something that the family would do together, like sit around and listen to it together, or?
Oh yeah, we'd do a lot of that. We got one paper, which was the Winnipeg Free Press, it was called, and we got that once a week, and they would have a story in there which would run in serials, you know, continued from one week to another, and we had a big table because we were 14, and we would all sit around the table, quiet as mice. One of my older brothers would be reading this story, and he would really get into it. He would really put emphasis into it. And one story I remember so well was called, it was a story of northern Saskatchewan, and it was called The Skyline of Spruce. You know, because when you get up into the north of Saskatchewan, that's all you see is the top of the spruce trees. So the story was called The Skyline of Spruce. It was a real good story, yeah.
So that would be something like what you think of today's generation, sitting around and watching TV as a family. You guys would sit around as a family. And
something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And how many brothers and sisters were in your family?
Well, there was 8 boys and 6 girls.
Can you take me from the oldest to the youngest?
Yeah, I can take you from Frank. My father's name was Franz, the real German name, and Frank was the oldest boy, and then Wilhelmina, and Regina, and Adeline, and Annie, and Casper, and Catherine, and Greg, Charlie, Tony, Brunhilde, myself, Irvin, and Alphonse.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there's a whole crew.
So tell me, what type of house did you grow up in?
Oh, it was a beautiful house. Do you have the picture of it, hon? It was again a small house to start out with, and of course when they first settled it was a sod house, but later on they built a wooden structure and then added on, and it was a 2-story house, and it was a beautiful home. It was well kept, and we were not allowed to go into the living room very often. Get the girls make sure that we stayed out of there, and also, one can understand with the heating system with no power, upstairs where we boys slept, when the wintertime was so cold that we always had a bottle of holy water standing there. That was our religion, and we sprinkle holy water, and sometimes we'd sprinkle holy air because it was frozen. Yeah.
So you said the boys would sleep upstairs. Was it just one large room?
No,
or?
there were 2 bedrooms and an area, open area at the top of the stairs.
Okay.
And the 1 bedroom didn't even have a window on it. But so the older boy slept in the 1 room where the window was in, and we younger ones slept in the other room. Sometimes when it was too cold, because because there was no forced air, you could hardly feel any warm air coming out of the register because it had to come up by gravity. And so sometimes when it was really cold, the 3 of us would be moved downstairs and sleep in the dining room in a open-up couch type of thing.
Did you guys have your own beds in those rooms, or did you share beds?
Oh, we shared beds, 3 in a bed, yeah. And sometimes 2 in a bed, 3 in a bed, yeah, type of thing.
Were the beds wooden beds, like homemade type?
No, they were all metal, bought beds, yeah.
Okay.
And good mattresses, and there were no box springs in those days, just a spring underneath and a mattress, but we all slept in the wintertime with the long johns on, that's what kept us in the warm. In the morning when you'd get up, you'd quick grab your pants and your socks and shirt and run downstairs where it was warm and get dressed down there.
So what did the family use to heat the house?
Pardon?
What was used to heat the house?
Oh, it was a big furnace. It was a big coal and wood furnace. And in the fall, when we could afford it, we would bring coal in. The coal usually came from Drumheller, Alberta, which was big lump coal. And you could throw a 1.5 by 1.5 square piece of coal into the furnace. It was that big a door on it. And then that would burn pretty well all night. And so there was heat where it went. There was heat, but it didn't go all over the house. That's the problem.
What about the wood? When you would use wood, where would you get the wood from?
In the early days, they had to go to Dundurn, which is about 20 miles southwest of here. And they'd go in the fall with the wagons, and of course that's where they delivered their grain too. So they would go down with the wagons full of grain and come home with wood from down there, because prairie fires had cleaned out everything as far as trees go around here when my parents and grandparents settled here. And then later on, once the prairie fires had been put under control, trees would grow up and people planted trees, and later on, we could cut some firewood around the sloughs and so on. But still, mostly the firewood was brought in by train, and if you had the money, you would buy it and use it.
Okay. You mentioned prairie fires. Did you ever see a prairie fire when you were growing up?
No, they were under control, because what they had done was they plowed fire guards around their homes. And so they usually saved their homes. But once the land started to get cultivated, it was a way different story. You might have found a prairie fire further north or west or someplace, but around here the land was cultivated, and by the end of the 20s even, there were no more prairie fires.
Where did the girls sleep in the house? Since the boys slept upstairs, where did
the girls slept in the wings that were built on, as you can see on the first story part. Okay. It's like that too, by the time my younger 2 brothers were born, my oldest brother was married already, was on his own. Wilhelmina, the oldest girl, had gone to the convent down in Vibank, and Regina had gone to Regina to a convent down there. 4 of my sisters became Catholic nuns.
Really?
Yeah, one of them went to India for 20 years as a missionary.
So who was in the house when you were growing up?
Well, Frank was married. Wilhelmina, Regina, and Adeline were gone from home. Those 3 had joined the convent. Okay. And so Catherine, my brother Frank would have been the oldest boy, and Catherine was the oldest girl.
Okay. So at the height in the house when you were a child, there was probably, 10 people? living in there at one time?
There'd have been 3 gone from the 14, 4 gone from the 14. In the, my sister Annie got married in 37, so the 4 girls and my brother Frank were gone in 37.
Okay.
So when I grew up in the early 30s, Adeline might have been at home for a year, and Annie for 2 or 3 years, and then after that, Casper would have been the oldest boy, and Catherine the oldest girl.
Okay. So, what type of furniture did you have in the house? Like, did you have...
It was bought furniture, a wooden table and chairs, Chesterfield and chairs. We were not what you would call a poor family. In fact, the 20s, of course, were good years here in the prairies. And we had a thrashing machine and a Model T car and an engine to thrash with and so on. But when the 30s hit, of course, then we had to take what most of the farmers did. They took the motor out of the cars and put a pole on the front and hooked 2 horses on the front. And they called it the Bennett wagon because Bennett was the Prime Minister of Canada. And so everybody called it the Bennett wagon. And it had rubber tires and springs on it, you know. It was a pretty nice way of traveling.
So, you mentioned that your family had a threshing machine. Would your parents then help out other neighboring farms do community farming?
Yeah. And it wasn't that often that we did that, but I do know that in 1935, when we had that crop where we had so much straw and hardly any grain, and his older boys would help us. What we would use 6 hay racks for hauling the sheaves in from the field. And we had 2 of the neighboring boys helping us, and then we'd go over and thrash for them. And we might have thrashed and charged them 3 cents a bushel or something like that. Was the method that was used for payment. And there were a few times where we would help one of the closer neighbors when they weren't done in the fall and we were done. We'd go and help them.
When you have that many people in a family, what was meal times like? Would you all sit around one table for meals, or?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. It was a real family farm, not like it is now that one is here and one is there. It was mealtime, and we'd line up from the oldest to the youngest and say grace before meal, and we'd all sit down and eat, and that happened 3 times a day. When it was mealtime, everybody was there. It was a time of one of the most important parts of our day.
What time would your day start in the morning usually?
Well, it depends, you know. If you're talking about the older boys who would be out on the field, they would be getting up at 5:30 or so. Us younger ones that were going to school wouldn't get up till maybe about 7, because school started at 9:30, and we'd have to walk most of the time in the summer. In the wintertime, we drove with a little closed-in sleigh, and that would be the start of the day. Noon meal was always at 12 o'clock, and the evening meal would be probably about 7:30 in the summertime, because the boys would come home from the fields at a little before 7, put the horses in the barn, and we'd probably eat about 7:30. In the wintertime, the evening meal would be around 6 o'clock.
You mentioned before that most of the work on your farm while you were growing up was by horsepower.
Yeah.
How long could the horses work before they needed to be rested?
Well, we would start probably at about 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and you would work till 11:30, and then you'd come home, put them in the barn for an hour and a half. That was always the practice. The horses had to have an hour and a half at noon. That gave us time to eat and relax a little bit too, and then you'd go out and you'd work, and the train would come from Saskatoon at 10 to 7. That's when we quit. We would watch the train, and that was our time, because we didn't have a watch with us. So when the train went, that was time to unhook and go home. Yeah.
Okay. So did your family ever experience overworking a horse, or a horse getting sick because of the labor that was out there? In
the 30s, there was a lot of problem like that. The horses were skinny, And the harness that they had on, the collars that they had on were made out of hard leather, and the shoulders would sometimes get sore. And you'd buy a thing called a sweat pad, which was made out of felt and lined with cloth, and you'd put that underneath the collar. And then sometimes, even at that, you'd have to put some ointment on them evenings because they had a sore, or sometimes you would have to let that horse rest for a few days till it healed up. We had about 30 horses on our farm, which we used. So they usually had 4 or 6 horses on an outfit, depending on what they were pulling.
Were the horses only used for work, or did the children sometimes use them for games and play?
Oh yeah, we used to go riding with them, During the working season, the seeding season especially, it was very hard to find a horse to go to town with. We had to walk to school in those days because all the horses, unless if you happened to have a horse that had a colt at that time and wasn't able to work, you would drive to town and the little colt would run alongside, and type of a thing.
What other animals were on your farm besides horses?
Well, we had cattle, of course, for beef and milking, and we had hogs, and we had chickens. Sometimes we usually had geese, and sometimes turkeys, and maybe a few times ducks, a few ducks. But the ducks were hard to raise because they wanted water, and sometimes we would have a big tin, something like a tub or something like that, dig it into the ground so it was ground level on top, and fill it up with water so the ducks could puddle around in there, type of a thing. Yeah. But it was all done, mostly done for food. The chickens, once they didn't lay anymore, or the roosters, they were butchered, and of course we didn't have freezers, so it was much more difficult than it is now.
So tell me a little bit about butchering a chicken. What did that consist of?
Well, first of all, you would go out and you would catch them, and you would take a knife or a hatchet and chop their head off and let them flutter around. That's why they say run around like a rooster with his head chopped off. They would flutter around like crazy until they lost their life. And then you would take them and dunk them into boiling water. And the boiling water would release all the feathers. Then you could just take the feathers off just like that. But you couldn't do that with waterfowl. Ducks and geese would not, you would not get the feathers off that way. There's no sense ducking them into boiling water because they wouldn't release their feathers. The chickens and the turkeys would, but not the ducks and the geese.
So how did you pluck a duck and a
goose? Oh, you
just
just pull them off, any west way you could. It's a good thing they were dead. But yeah, and then you'd have to sit there and pull out pin feathers. I remember one year just before Christmas, it was one in the 30s when times were poor, and of course we never got presents for Christmas, but we would always get nuts and candies and maybe an orange or something like that. And I remember this time we were all sitting around the big table and pulling goose feathers off and pin feathers off, and my dad would say, okay, you guys come on work, or else you're not going to get any nuts for Christmas because they're just going to buy our Christmas nuts.
So, with butchering a chicken, what parts of the chicken would the family use for meals?
Well, pretty well everything. You eviscerate them, you take all the insides out. We never saved the heart, the gizzard, and the liver. We never used that. The insides were all thrown away. But the rest of it, the wings, the drumsticks, the legs we didn't. There was a few times when my dad would take the legs, and you'd put them into boiling water, and I don't know what they ate off of them. I never ate any of them. But I don't know what was on there to eat neither. We didn't later on in life. But in those days, you didn't waste anything. It was anything that could be used was used. Yeah.
So would your mom can chicken?
Yeah,
or?
That's what we would do then because we didn't have a freezer. And if I remember correctly, same with meat. I know I shot a couple of deer one time, and I poached them. I was out of season. But those were the days of survival. So anyways, what we would do, we would skin the animal or the chickens, you take the feathers off, and you would cut them into pieces, stick them into a quart sealer or a 2-quart sealer, and I don't know what else they put in there, but I do know that you had to boil them for 3 hours. And put them in a canner and boil them for 3 hours. Where fruit, on the other hand, you do that for 20 minutes. But the meat had to be done for 3 hours. And that, you can imagine the heat that was in the house when that was going on in the summertime.
So did your mother have what they call a summer kitchen at all?
Oh yeah, yeah, we had a summer kitchen. The only thing that was better about that was that there were windows all the way around and you could open them up and you'd get a breeze going through and it was a little cooler. We had that summer kitchen until about 1932 when my brother was married, his house burned down. And then we gave him the summer kitchen. He lived about a mile away and we loaded it up on wagons and pulled the summer kitchen over there. And he used that for a house then until a few years later he built himself a different house. So we lost our summer kitchen. To fire, but to a different fire.
You mentioned that you shot a deer and that it was poached at that time. So were there like you would have to get a tag and stuff back then?
Well, no, it wasn't that. It was just a customary thing. You shouldn't shoot deer in the summer. In the fall there would be open season, you know, and you could go and shoot. But you know, in those days, is my uncle who loved hunting. He'd shoot anything, anytime. And that was basically the principle, you know. If it was available, you would the opportunity was there. You would avail yourself of that opportunity. We shot ducks in the spring all the time.
How old were you when you started hunting?
Oh, about 11, 12, I guess. That was part of life, you know. Yeah, we used slingshots and bows and arrows and anything under the sun, and we got good with them. I'll tell you, we got to be real good with them.
Do you remember who taught you how to shoot a shotgun?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
When did you start learning to shoot?
Well, when my shoulder could take it, because they pound pretty hard when you shoot those things. Yeah, well, I'd have been about 14, I guess. My dad was a hunter. My grandfather was a great hunter. When they moved here, hunting fox was a big thing. There were a lot of fox up here. And, you know, this is all a matter of survival. You know, there was... I think the police, if they would have been around, they'd have probably turned the other way because they probably did it themselves.
Did you hunt anything else besides deer and duck and geese?
I managed to shoot a coyote one time with a .22. He was coming out of a bush while I was walking there, and on the run I happened to hit him and knocked him over.
Were there a lot of coyotes when you were growing up?
Oh yes, there were a lot of coyotes. When our fathers first settled here, my dad used to say that the shores of the sloughs in the springtime were loaded with muskrats. It was just brown with muskrats because there was a lot of grass and a lot of trapped snow in the wintertime and a lot of water in the spring. But the muskrats disappeared then, especially when the dry 30s came along. And we had no fox until, well, we had, towards the end of the 30s, the badgers started to move in. Now, trapping was a big thing in here. You know, you would get $20 for a badger or something like that, which was a lot of money, or a fox. So weasels and jackrabbits were popular, very popular here. And we'd get a couple of bucks for a weasel and maybe 25 cents for a rabbit, and that was big money. So we did a lot of that, yeah. And same with shooting too, you know, if you would shoot rabbits, and later on we got fox and coyotes, and you know, and so. But these things all run in cycles. Right now it's hard to find a jackrabbit.
So how did you trap badgers and foxes?
Well, I never trapped any fox. I trapped rabbits. For rabbits, we would get what they call the gopher trap. And we would take a sheaf of oats, lay it down, set the trap in front of it, conceal it in the snow so the rabbit couldn't see it. And when he came up to eat, he'd step into the trap. But we would always put a log on the end of the trap that he could pull it, so that he could pull it away, because if you didn't, they would chew off their legs and get away. Oh yes, but if you put a log on there that he could pull this, then he'd pull it away, and the next morning you could go out and you could see the trail in the snow where he went, and you'd catch him and kill him. Yeah.
So how did you kill him once you caught him?
Oh, just hit him on the head with a club. That was the fastest way. We didn't try to torture them, you know. You try and take them out of their misery as quick as you could.
When you would bring them into town or to get your money, did you bring the whole jackrabbit?
No. We would skin them and put them on a board, which is called a stretcher, and let them dry, and then you would sell the skin. The carcass we would throw away. Very seldom that we would eat any rabbit meat.
Did you still hunt throughout your adult years?
Pardon?
Did you continue hunting throughout your adult years?
Oh yes, when the muskrats came in the early 50s, we started trapping muskrat and mink. And then you get into animals that are very difficult to trap. The mink is very difficult to trap. They're very smart. But I managed them to catch one. That's the only one I got. But muskrats, we caught a lot of muskrats. But the muskrats, we didn't skin. We just sold them the way they came, and the fur buyers, whatever they did with them, yeah.
So, I'm imagining then, since your dad was a hunter and your grandfather was a hunter, the shotguns that you would use as a kid, you would just use your dad's and...
Oh yeah. We had a German 22 rifle, and it's written on the bottom in German. And we had our 22s with us wherever we went, winter or summer. Because if you'd see something that you could shoot, a weasel or something like that, you wouldn't want to miss the opportunity. And one day we were hauling wheat in a wagon, and we had this German rifle sticking in with the butt end into the wheat. And it knocked so much that it fell out, and the wagon wheel went over it and bent the front of the barrel. So I cut it off, and I used it as a pistol, and I still have it downstairs.
Really?
Yeah, and it's still, the German writing is still on the bottom of it, yeah.
Going back to kind of the daily life, got a little sidetracked with the hunting. I haven't really met a lot of people that hunted, so it kind of was very interesting to go that way. With butchering, you would butcher chickens. Did you also butcher your cows and your pigs? How would you do that process?
Well, when you butchered a beef, whether it was a cow or whether it was a steer, and you would always butcher this in the fall, when it started getting cold, because we didn't have any freezers. And what you would do is you would either shoot the beef in the head with a 22, and you had to be careful that you'd have to know where you would shoot them, and they would just drop. They were unconscious. And when they were unconscious, then you would behead them. And then you would have, we had a rig called a derrick, which was 3 poles, something like your tripod there, with a pulley in the center, but bigger, up maybe 12 feet high. And then you would, on the hind legs of an animal, if you cut them at the right spot, you get inside the sinew and you can hook them on and you can lift the whole animal up. It will not tear out. And you have to know that, but you'd learn it from your father and so on. And then you would take it up and you would take the cut it down the center of the stomach, take the insides all out, quarter it and skin it and quarter it. And what we would do, we would hang it then. We have a place called the ice house. And what you would do, you dig a hole in the ground about 8 feet deep and about 8 feet square. And in the winter time, you would fill it up with ice from the trough where the horses and the cattle drank. You would chip the ice out and put it in, or else you would just put water in and freeze it and make it a solid tube of ice. Later on, we got a better idea, and in the spring, we would put slushy snow in and pack it with our feet. And then you would have it cold all summer. And that's where you would set your milk and cream and things on, and you'd cover it with straw, and you could keep milk or cream in there, just almost like in a freezer that was run with ice, they used to have. But then in the fall, when you butchered, you would always hang this meat into the ice house and let it freeze. And it could stay in there as long as it was frozen. And the winters in those days were such that you never got a thaw. It would stay frozen all winter. The pork, you would butcher the hog at that time of the year too. And there you would take the hams and maybe pork chops or something like that, and you would put them into snow and pack them into snow and keep them in this ice house in the snow. But you had to, you would also smoke that. We had what you call a smokehouse. It was just an old building with lots of cracks in the walls and a barrel inside, and you would make a fire in there, and you'd hang the meat around the outside, and the smoke that would come out, which would go through the cracks and through the chimney and so on, would smoke the meat. And flies would not attack smoked meat. So you could leave hams hang in the summertime, even though it was warm outside. They would not spoil. Same with bacon. Once it was smoked, it would keep that way. Not all summer, but until late spring at least. The beef, you would have to make sure that that's all gone by the time it melted. We had a lot of fish because in those days as Catholics we had to eat fish. Wednesdays and Fridays were meatless days. So people would come from up north with a truckload of fish, and you would buy what you wanted to need for the winter, and we would stick them into the grain because the grain was cold, and they would stay frozen in there all winter long. And it was kind of funny though, because Mum would say go down and get a fish, so you go down, dig around till you found one. Well, finally there were no more fish left. But in the summer when you hauled grain, all at once a fish would come out of the grain.
So did you ever go fishing when you were a child for your own fish?
No, we had no water around here to fish. There was nothing around here where you could go fishing. We have now, because we have a canal running through here and feeds a few reservoirs for the potash mines, and people fish in there, but there was no, we couldn't go skinny dipping. Heck, there wasn't deeper water than this.
What about making sausage? Did you make a lot of sausage when you were a kid?
Yeah. Made a lot of sausage. And of course you had the machines, the grinder to grind up the meat, and you used the casings from the hog. They would be cleaned and they would be boiled, so they would be clean, and then that's what you used for the casings for the sausage. And you know, they made different kinds. They made liver sausage. They made what they called pork sausage and different kinds of things. They made head cheese, and you can even buy that in the store, although I never cared for it.
So what is head cheese?
Oh, God, I don't know. It was too grueling to watch, so I couldn't tell you.
Would it be a meal in
They
itself?
they used the stomach. They cleaned out the stomach, and that was the thing they put the head cheese in. And they must have used some things from the head in order to give it the name head cheese. And it was a different kind of meat from the different parts of the body. I don't know what kind they used. And somewhere along the line, I don't know what they call it in English. There's a jellyish substance that comes from I think from the hoofs of the pig. And they would put that in, and when you sliced the head cheese, it had this kind of jellyish substance around it. You know, and I guess that's what turned me off.
So would it be served as like a meal for?
Yeah, it would be served as a meat. It would be served like, you know, sliced, instead of sliced meat, it would be sliced head cheese. You can buy head cheese in the stores right now.
In Canada.
In Canada. Oh, I don't know, maybe down there too if you get into the right area. Yeah.
You mentioned liver sausage. Mm-hmm. How did they make liver sausage?
They boiled the liver, and I don't know what else they put into it, because they must have used more than just the liver. But the liver sausages are pretty good. I didn't mind the liver sausages. They called the pork sausage, they call it a bread sausage. I don't know why they called it that way. Well, no, that's not right. They called it broodwurst, which means frying. It's a frying. It's like the little pork sausages that you fry. Huh? It was that kind of a sausage.
So the sausage, would that be something that they would smoke until it was cooked?
Yeah, they would. It was raw meat. It was put into the casing and was smoked. Okay. And then when you wanted to cook it, you would. Not everybody did it that way, but that's the way most of the people did. First of all, you boil it for quite a while. And then you take it out and put it in a frying pan and fry it. That's where the word broodwurst comes in, frying it, yeah.
What about making homemade alcohol? Was that something that your parents did?
No, we never had made any wine or any beer or any alcohol homebrew or anything. But there was lots of it done around here that I know of. My father was not an alcoholic man. We celebrated names days more than birthdays. As Catholic people, the name was always a saint, you know, and St. Francis and so on. And so when it was his name's day, he would have a bottle of rye. And when we came out and wished him a happy name's day, even as little kids of about 10 years old, he'd give us a little shot glass of rye. Of whiskey, yeah. Because Well, we call it rye up here. It's whiskey. It was made out of rye, and that's why we call it rye whiskey.
Okay. So, what would a typical breakfast consist of when you were growing up?
Bowl of cereal was the first thing. Oatmeal when times were good. And what we call Sonny Boy was when times were poor. We would take wheat and grind it in a little coffee grinder and boil it. And we called it Sonny Boy. Coffee was made in the, of course, when we had, the good years we had coffee, but in the bad years we took wheat and put it in the oven and burned it till it was black and ground it up and used it as coffee, yep. Some people used barley, we used wheat, yep.
I don't think I've ever heard that before. That's...
Yeah. The baking, my sisters were fabulous at baking. My sister Catherine could make you an angel food cake like that out of scratch. She would sift the flour 10 times, and all 12 or so egg whites went into it, and so on. And yeah, the breakfast started with cereal, homemade bread. When we had the time, we would take. We had a toasting mechanism about the size of this page, out of wire with a handle on it, and another wire that flipped on top. And you would take this and you would hold it over take the lid off of the stove, and the heat coming out, and you'd hold it on there and it would burn it. It wouldn't really toast it, it mostly burned it. You turn it over the other way and do the other side, and that was our toast. And it's kind of funny because I remember some winters when we didn't go to school because it was too cold. Sometimes the school was even shut down for 2 weeks because it was too cold. And then my job would be to make toast in the morning till the boys would come in from the stove, from the barn. And I'd have a pile of toast like this there. It was all cold, but it was toast. And sometimes we had an egg. Eggs were rationed because the chickens didn't really lay much in the wintertime. So sometimes, you know, there was one egg for each one, or else Dad would have an egg and the older boys or something like that, you know. But it was toast, cereal and toast and butter. Sometimes we had homemade cheese, but that was our breakfast.
So how did you get butter? Did you?
We made our own butter. You'd let the cream get sour, and then you put it in a butter churn. You had a handle, a crank on there, and you cranked it until it, and you'd have to have a lot of patience because sometimes it wasn't just right, and it would take a long time. But all at once you could hear it flopping, and it was hard to turn, and then you knew you had butter in there. Then they'd skim off the milk, and they called it buttermilk. I never cared for it, but some people did. And then the butter. Well, sometimes, you know, when there was time, my mother would go and make molds, and sometimes we even sold butter in town. You'd bring it to town because the town people didn't have butter, and you took it to the grocery store and you buy groceries in return for the butter. And I'll tell you a real cute one. We had a grocery store here in town here. Name was Mike Steckler, and a woman came in and she brought in a whole bunch of butter, and sold it to him. And she says, now that you've got my butter, I'd like to buy a pound of butter. And he says, well, why don't you keep any of yours? And she says, well, a mouse fell into it, he said. But she says, you know, it isn't, I took it out right away. She says, it didn't hurt anything. And the people who buy it won't know this, so it won't hurt them anything. Oh, he says, that's fine. He took her butter and put it in the back and came back, brought her a pound of butter. And he says, here, and she took the butter, went home, and he says, I gave her one of hers back. She didn't know it neither.
So were mice pretty common back in the houses in those days? Oh, yeah.
The houses were such, you know, that there were cracks here and cracks there, and you had mouse traps and so on. And yeah, you know, you had to protect yourself against them because like I said, when my dad brought home those 10 bags of 100-pound bags of flour, we went down into the basement and we nailed from the joists boards down and boards across and planks, and we put the flour up there so the mice couldn't get at it, because on the floor they would have gotten into the flour. Things were covered, you know, so that they didn't, and it's not that you had mice running all over the place, but sometimes you would see some mice droppings here or there, and you'd set traps and eventually get them.
You mentioned that you would occasionally have cheese with your breakfast. How would you come across cheese? Was that something that you'd buy in the store?
No, no. We had, you would take, I think it was sour cream, and they put it into a little cloth bag, but it wasn't cheesecloth, but it was something like that, you know, so it could drip through. And they'd hang it out under the eaves. And the stuff would drip off onto the ground, and when that had all dripped out, and whatever fermenting that went on or what, and that's how you get cottage cheese, and you can buy cottage cheese nowadays. No, they make it in a more sanitary way, I'm quite sure, but we didn't die from it, so it must have been okay. And then they would also take some of that, and they would put it in a frying pan somehow, and they would fry it, and it became a gooey type of a cheese, but no, it wasn't just too bad.
If you wanted to get like what we have for cheese for a sandwich, like we have, you know, like a brick of cheese, would that be something you would have to go to the store for? Or?
Oh yeah, yeah. Okay. And you know, that was a real treat to us. If we could get a piece of bought sausage, or bought cheese, or bought bread, oh man, we were on cloud nine. Now we're spoiled, and we'd like to have some homemade bread.
What was a common, well actually, did you call it dinner or did you call it lunch, your noon meal?
We called it dinner, yeah.
Okay, so what was a common noon meal? Dinner?
Always soup. All, without fail, my mother would know, the girls would make soup. Chicken noodle soup, beef soup, where they'd put pieces of beef into it, or roast or steak or something like that. You know, we didn't have barbecue. Steak was not a big thing in our days. It was roast, and hamburger was a big thing. Whatever didn't fit into a roast or something like that was put into hamburger. And then, of course, you know, we would have chicken. We'd have an awful lot of chicken because, you know, it was, you know, if company would come, for instance, 10 o'clock in the morning, mother would say, go out and catch a rooster. So there goes one rooster into the pot, you know, and that's the dinner then. Oh, I'll tell you another good one. That was kind of cute too. A guy from Calgary who sold the Country Guide paper, monthly magazine. He came around one time in the 30s, and my mother and I were the only ones at home. And he wanted to sell a subscription. And my mother says, well, I haven't got any money. And he says, yeah, I know. He says, it's very difficult because that's what I live on. He said, if I can sell some subscriptions. So my mother had pity on him, so she says, well, what if I give you 3 roosters for your subscription? Oh, that's great. So I caught 3 roosters, put them in a gunny sack, and he took them, and we got the Country Guide for a year.
So was it common to have salesmen come to the house back then to sell things?
No, very seldom that somebody would come around. Another thing that you might not be aware of, and that was when the Second World War was on, and we had a radio, and whoever had a radio had to buy a license to have a radio. And of course, in those days, you had an antenna wire outside running from the house to a building or a tree or something to pick up the signal. But a guy would drive into the yard, and he had a big round disc like that on top of his car. And through that, he could tell whether you had a radio or not. And if you didn't have a license, he would fine you. The way the government wanted to make a few extra bucks, huh?
So if you would have soups at home for your dinner, what would you take to school for dinner? We'd
always have sandwiches. In the better years, we'd have an apple maybe, and of course, apples weren't all year long like they are now. You'd get them in the fall when the crops in British Columbia is where we get our apples from. And they used to come in here in a carload, just loose in a boxcar. And you drive down with your wagon or your buggy or whatever, and you drive up alongside with your boxes, and they'd fill them up. And I was a little kid sitting on the buggy holding the reins for my dad's horse when the guy threw me an apple from the boxcar, and I caught it, and you know, an apple was a nice treat. And then we would take these apples home in the boxes, and by the time February came along, there were no more apples available. The refrigeration wasn't like it is now, even in the stores in town, you know. So yes, when the times were good, we would have an apple and sandwiches. And sometimes, you know, cookies. The girls would bake some cookies. Or a piece of cake or something along that line. That was our lunch for school, yeah. But there were lots of times. It was very hard because, you know, we were a big family. We were a poor family during the 30s, although we were never hungry. But sometimes, you know, the sandwiches were made out of homemade bread, this thick 2 slices, and then some of that old cheese, that good gooey cheese in between the thing was about that thick. So you kind of sit off in a corner someplace where nobody could see what you were eating because you felt pretty bad about it.
So that gooey cheese, was it pretty tasty, or was
No, it wasn't very tasty, but it plugged the hole.
What about ice cream? Did you guys have ice cream?
Yes. You see, that was the beauty of it. You know, we had cows. We had our own cream. We had ice cream an awful lot. But because the family was so great, you'd make that little freezer full, and each one got a wee little dish, and I couldn't wait until someday I could sit down and have as much ice cream as I could possibly eat, just for once. But yeah, we made a lot of ice cream. And my mother was very smart, you know, and lots of times Saturday evenings was a time to go to town. The girls would come into town, the boys would come into town, and the boys would stand there and whistle at the girls and these kinds of things. You know, there was a Saturday night was a big thing. But when the hockey games were on, we wanted to listen to the hockey games on the radio. But some of the older boys would rather go to town, and they would ride into town horseback because it was only a couple of miles away. So my mother would get us to make a freezer full of ice cream in the afternoon and sometimes bake a cake. And if you go to town, you don't get any ice cream. So the boys would all stay home and eat ice cream and listen to the hockey game. I had great parents. Oh man, I had terrific parents. Yeah. My mother would slice a roast, you know, a raw roast, and fry it in a frying pan with gravy on it. Boiled potatoes, mashed potatoes. But the soup was the dinner meal, not the supper meal. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about potatoes with the supper meals. Were potatoes something you grew in your garden?
Oh yeah, we would always have a big garden, lots of potatoes. We would plant them with a plow, with the horses, and the horses would pull and it would be a 2-bottom plow. And in the last furrow then, somebody would walk behind the plow and lay the potatoes into the ground. And then when you came around the next time, the front bottom of the plow would cover this one and leave you the back one to put more potatoes in. So the rows were about, the plows were about 12 inches each, so there was 24 inches in between the rows of potatoes. And then we would have a little cultivator that would fit in between, and somebody would sit on a horse and ride it and hook it on this cultivator, and you go through the center, and that's how you would till and keep the weeds down. But still had to go out with a hoe and hoe in between. But I know, like, the rows were sometimes so long that one of my brothers would say, oh, these rows go through the mile. Well, it wasn't quite that bad, you know. It was only maybe a few hundred feet or yards, but there were long rows, lots of potatoes, yes. Sometimes, and it's odd because I can't remember any year except 1937 where we didn't have a bountiful garden crop.
You know, with all these planting of potatoes, when would they be ready to actually pick and eat?
Well, with the potatoes, we usually planted in the beginning of May, and by the middle of August already you could pick some potatoes. But you wouldn't, you'd take it a little easy, you know, because they weren't full grown yet. So you would let them grow a little more if possible.
So how many potatoes would you usually get out of 1 year's worth of gardening?
Half-ton truck load.
And would they keep? Would you sell them?
Oh yeah.
Or?
No, they would keep. We had, and most farmers had that, what they call the dark room, a room with no window, or just a wee little window, just to let a little bit of light come in, so you didn't need a light when you went in. But it was in the basement, and it was off to one side, and it was very cool in there compared to, you know, even in a house right now, it's much cooler down in the basement than it is up here. And so when you had the doors closed and everything, it would stay quite cool in there. Potatoes would usually keep till about the beginning of June, even a little, maybe the middle of June. And then you had a couple of months where you didn't have any, and then you'd be back to the new crop again.
Huh. What about what other types of vegetables and fruit did you grow in the garden?
Well, fruit, we didn't have any fruit in our yard. But we had peas, and of course there again too, you know, this was a big job. Go and pick all those peas and sit down in the basement where it was cool. When you had a lot of hands, you know, it didn't take too long to shell maybe a bushel or so of peas. And then they would can them, you know, boil them for 20 minutes. To fill up the sealers with the quart sealers, or the 2-quart sealers, fill them up with peas. Put in some water, I suppose maybe they put salt in or whatever to flavor it, and then you put the lids on quite not tight, and then you'd put it into this thing full of water, we call it a canner, and set them all in there, and then this water would boil, and that way the liquid inside start boiling too in the jars, and you do that for 20 minutes. Then you seal them off tight, close them up tight with a rubber ring on top, and they'd keep for years that way.
So who was responsible for tending to the garden?
Well, there was one boss, and that was Dad or Mom, and the rest was the work was done by us. You know, okay, boys, today you hoe the garden. Well, you just go up there and complain and hoe the garden, and that was life.
And you mentioned potatoes and peas, but what other types of vegetables were out there?
Corn. We would grow a lot of corn, tomatoes, carrots, and radishes. We'd grow some, sometimes cucumbers, sometimes we would grow the cantaloupes, and the odd times watermelons. But watermelons and cantaloupes only grew in certain years. They want sandy soil and they need a certain kind of temperature, and so they didn't grow every year. But the corn, we would never leave it on the cob. It was always taken with a knife and shaved off, kernel corn, and put into sealers. And you would be surprised, you know, if you went into our dark room and see the 25, 30 jars of this and 25 and 40 jars of that, you know, standing there. And a lot of, well, they made sauerkraut. Oh, yeah, I didn't like sauerkraut, but they made sauerkraut.
And you're German?
Yes, I know. I'm sorry, but I can't. I don't. I had no use for sauerkraut. But they would grow a lot of cabbage. And in cabbage, you had to spray it every once in a while because those doggone little white butterflies, we call them cabbage butterflies, they would lay eggs in there and then little green worms would come out. So you had to go around sprinkle them with this powder so you wouldn't have that problem. Huh? And so they would cut this up, and they had a machine that they used for slicing the cabbage, and they'd make sauerkraut out of it. But they had earthen crocks, 5-gallon crocks like that, and they'd make it full of sauerkraut. And they also had, for pickles, dill pickles, lots of dill pickles, made in those same crocks type of thing. They even had, we would, in the summertime, the chickens would lay much better than in the wintertime, of course. And so they would take eggs and they would put them into a crock like that. And they had a thing they called a water glass. I don't know, it was at a powder, I think it was. And they would put it into this crock, and it would keep the eggs, the raw eggs, in there. We wouldn't use them to eat them, but we'd use them for baking. I don't know, you know, I wasn't a cook, so I don't know what the difference was, but I know that that's the way it was with them. Beans, we grow a lot of beans, either the green beans and can them, or else the pinto beans, I think they're called. You let them get dry in the fall, and then you put them in a gunny sack and you'd hit them on the ground, and the shells, you know, they break open real easy because they're dry. And then you would take them and lay them on a clean tablecloth or something in the wind and throw them up in the air, and the wind would blow the chaff away, and you finally had nothing but beans left. And those were, out of them, they would make pork and beans then.
What about, you talked about having a lot of corn. What about popcorn? Was that something that you would have for?
No.
No?
Never knew what popcorn was in my young days. In, I think it was in 1937, we got an infestation of what they call the webworm. It was a little green worm about 1 inch long, and just everything was covered with those crazy little worms. They would climb up one side of the house over the roof and down the other side. You could even watch them go. And it was because it was such a bad year, and we had cattle, and nothing was growing, and there, but you know, once you saw that the high spots were burning out, and the low spots were a little green yet, my father would think that, well, maybe those low spots we could get our seed back or something, huh? So we had to herd the cattle and keep them on the high spots, and they wanted to go into the green spots. So you'd sit on your horse, out there and keep the cattle away from those green spots. And those crazy little worms would climb up the horse's leg and come up where you were sitting on top of the horse. Yeah, it was unbelievable. For about, I would say, maybe 3 weeks or so, we had this infestation of what they called a webworm.
Did you have any other types of infestation?
Grasshoppers, a lot of grasshoppers. Mosquitoes, well, we haven't still yet. We had grasshoppers pretty bad a few years ago. We have a wet year, you don't have grasshoppers, but you got mosquitoes. And they kind of change off, like that.
Do you remember the grasshoppers ever doing some serious damage to the crops?
Oh yes, yeah. When I was, back in the 40s when I was helping along on the farm, once I became 16 or 14 or so, we'd help along on the farm. And what we used for grasshoppers would be, they would use sawdust and make it real wet and put it into a cement mixer and put in the chemical, and I don't know what the name of the poison was that they mixed with it. And they would mix this together. And then you would take it and you would put it on the back of your buggy or wagon or whatever you were, and you had a tub full of this stuff. And early in the morning you would go out and you'd take a board about this wide and about this long, and you'd spread it out like that where the grasshoppers were. And they wanted the moisture early in the morning. And so they would eat this stuff and they'd get the poison and they would die. But it didn't work very well, but you felt better when you had done something, So that was what we used then. But then later on, when we got sprayers into the 50s, we'd get a chemical called dieldrin. And boy, you would go around the outside of a field and that was it. No grasshopper went through that. It would kill them on contact. But it didn't take long until there was a stink raised that it would not deteriorate. It would carry on, the residue would carry on into the grain and so on, so they took it off of the market. So now they have something that works a little better than the sawdust, but not as good as the dieldrin.
So, when you were growing up, you have talked a lot about the types of food you ate, but what about some traditional German meals? Do you remember any of the traditional German meals?
Yes, a lot of it was noodles. The flour that my dad bought, like in those 100-pound bags, we lived on noodles and bread. And they pretty well all tasted the same. There was the cream noodle, and there was the big noodle, and they had different names for them, but they were pretty well all the same. One batch was made, they would take the dough, pull off little pieces like that and throw it into the pot with some oil in it, I suppose, or something like that. And they would boil it, and then they'd put some cream in. And then they were creamy noodles, huh? The other ones were, we just made big round noodles like this and put them in, and put potatoes into the pot along with them, and roasted them or whatever they did in that pot. And they were good. They had little crusts on them, and they were real good, yeah. And then they had another kind of a noodle that they spread out, and they'd put cream on it, and they'd roll it together and cut it like that and put it in and cook them. And they were all made out of dough with cream, basically. But they tasted a little different than the other ones did, so you had some variety.
In your family, who was responsible for the cooking? Did the boys ever help, or was it just the girls?
No. The girls, in fact, the girls had to work outside most of the time. When you had 30 horses and you had 6 horses on this outfit and 6 horses on that and 4 on this one and 4 on that one, you had quite a few implements going. And sometimes, there's hired men, sometimes 2. And so, yeah, the girls did the cooking. Like I said, once the girls got to be 16 and 17 years of age, my mother didn't have to do any laundry or, any of the cooking or the house cleaning and those kind of things. So, she was busy having kids. She didn't have time to do that kind of stuff.
What about hygiene? When you were growing up, what about taking baths and brushing teeth?
Well, that was something that it was very difficult. We would set up a bathtub. We had a bathtub. And we'd set it up in one of the sheds out there. And then, of course, Saturday night comes along, well, everybody's got to take a bath. Well, the cleanest ones would go in first, and that was the girls. And then the oldest boys, and by the time it come down to us guys, the towel was wet, the water was dirty, and you washed the best you could. In the wintertime, we would sponge bath, we called it. Strip ourselves down to the waist and wash the top, and then wash the bottom and with a face cloth or something like that, you know. We had lye soap and held out, would take the germs away for a whole week.
And brushing your teeth, was that something that...
Yeah, we didn't have toothbrushes, but my mother made us take a little rag and put it around our finger, and we'd go in there and work around it. When you went to school, they said, "You brush your teeth this morning?" Yep. Yep, we tried.
And since you didn't have running water, I imagine that you had an outhouse.
Yep, yep.
How far was that from the house?
One farmer was very smart. He put the wood pile in between the outhouse and the house. So every time you went to the outhouse, you brought an armful of wood along. It was usually, maybe 200 yards, something like that, away off to one side. And when it was full, you'd dig a new hole and move the outhouse over there and throw the ground in this one and cover this one up, and like that you'd go along, yeah.
What'd you use for toilet paper?
Catalogs. I've got a cute song called about the outhouse in the green, green grass at home. I sing it when I go out at concerts and so on.
You have a song about it?
Oh yeah, I've got it on tape downstairs if you wanted time to listen to it.
Oh, that would be great.
I get quite a bang out of it.